By the time this video comes out, we will already be a month into quarter 2 of this year, but I never got the opportunity to reflect on my quarter 1 and my beginning of the year of reading, so we're going to go ahead and do that today. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Annie. In this video, I'm going to provide a quarter 1 reading wrap up for you all and reflect on all the good reading I was able to do at the beginning of the year. I was able to read 12 books between January and March, which actually is a huge surprise for me because I was in a pretty big reading slump at the beginning of this year, but I'm really excited to just reflect and recap all the books that I read. If you catch me looking down, I do have my notebook right here because I wanted to make sure that I had a good recap and a good reflection on every single book I read because January feels so far away and I want to make sure I remember all the details for you all. So let's go ahead and get started and get into the wrap up. The first book I read and completed this year was The Strength of the Few by James Islington, which is the sequel to The Will of the Many in the same series. The Will of the Many is a Roman-inspired fantasy series where certain characters have will ceded to them, which allows them more strength and power. This sequel was highly anticipated because there was a very complicated ending to book 1 that led a lot of people uncertain and unsure of how this book was going to live up to book 1. And I thought it was overall pretty enjoyable. I gave the book 3 stars, but I did have a few gripes with it. The book gets into kind of the political side of this society and this world, and I felt like that was a little far-fetched at times, but I did still enjoy it. It's also a very plot-forward book, and at times I felt a little frustrated because I wanted more character development and character depth to some of the characters we saw in the first novel, and we really only get that with our main character just due to the circumstances of how the book goes on. The second book I completed this year was Lucky Girl by Allie tagle-dokus, which I rated 4 stars. This book essentially follows a girl going through a dance mom's type journey similar to Maddie Ziegler. She starts on this reality TV show doing dancing and then ends up in the grasps of a very famous person who's kind of mentally unstable, and she kind of gets involved in her life and is thrust into fame, and the book kind of delves into all the things that comes with that. It is a super interesting book, and if you're a fan of reality TV, I would say that I really, really recommend it for that reason. That being said, I did see a couple critiques that were saying that this is just super similar to what actually happened with Maddie Ziegler and Sia, so if that's going to bother you, that might not quite work. There also is a lot of playing around with the formatting in this book, which I thought was really interesting, and I really enjoyed the experimentation, but in some ways I don't know that it was the best way to tell the story at times, and in sometimes kind of took away from the story that the author was telling. So just something to keep in mind, but I think it's still a really fun book, and I devoured it in, I want to say, like 1 or 2 days. The third book I read this year was The Book of Luke by Lovell. This is also a reality TV type book and follows a man who is on a Survivor or The Challenge type show, and it's actually following him coming back to the show after being on it originally, and now they're doing like a all-stars type series, and it is very interesting. It has a lot of good queer representation, but I had a lot of problems with it. I ended up rating it 3.5 stars, but I did think it was still really fun and really messy and delved into all the fun parts of reality TV, the characters that come with it, the big personalities, the people who are naturally drawn to that type of environment. But there is a villain in this book that they try to make you sympathetic toward, and I found it so incredibly frustrating because this villain is a transphobic Republican senator. I want to say he's a senator, he could be a representative, but he's a politician who is transphobic, and we are supposed to feel sympathy towards him toward the end of the book, and I found him completely despicable, completely unlikable, and I really couldn't get past this. If I knew going in that that was going to be a character, I don't think I would even have picked it up. I think the rest of the story is still really interesting. He is just a horrible character, and I found that really frustrating to read. The next book I read this year was Deep Cuts by Brickley. This is a book about falling in love through music, or two musicians falling in love. And it is set in the backdrop of like the late 90s, early 2000s, and both characters just clearly show so much care and love toward music and the making of music and everything that comes along with that. I think that this is a really fun book. I gave it 4 stars, and I really loved our main female protagonist, and especially as she goes through college and then goes through after college of just kind of like the journey of discovering yourself in your 20s. I found that to be a really captivating story. I think that where the book kind of lost me at times was that our male protagonist can be quite frustrating, and I felt like a lot of the decisions that he made or continued to make were just not good for our female characters. So I had trouble rooting for their love story at times because he was so insufferable. But it is a really good book. If you love music, I think this would really work for you. I don't think I'm like particularly a music person where music is like something really important to me, but I still thought it was a good book. And I do love books about the early 2000s and the late 90s because that reminds me a lot of my childhood and growing up during that time. So I think that if you're nostalgic for that time, I think it would be a good pick. And overall, I think I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for like more of a love story with like a coming of age story as well, rather than just a traditional romance. We have a brief intermission because Robot wants to be sitting on my lap right now. So if you hear him purring away down there, that's what's going on. But let me grab the next book. The next book I read this year was The Terror by Dan Simmons. This is a fascinating portrayal into the failed Northwest Passage, which was essentially this crew of sailors and soldiers who wanted to really explore the northern part of the world via boat, and they ended up getting trapped in the ice and ultimately lost. We don't know really what happened to them, but it can be kind of presumed that they starved and froze to death. This book incorporates even more. It incorporates a supernatural element of a monster coming to hunt and kill these sailors and soldiers, and I found it really interesting. I gave it 4 stars. It is not the type of book I normally gravitate toward, but my brother really enjoyed it, so I picked it up because I love to connect with my family over book, and I thought it was really interesting. It is gruesome. Dan Simmons does not spare a single detail in terms of seeing these people fall to scurvy, fall to severe illness, fall to severe injury, just totally freeze to death and deal with the absolute brutality that they are seeing in the Arctic, and I thought that that was really interesting. There is a single female character, and I have a lot of question marks on how she was portrayed, but I think if you can look past that, which can be a challenge, I think it is a really interesting book. And that being said, this expedition would be primarily just men, so I can understand why the portrayal was that way, especially given the time period it's set in, but it is something you kind of have to like think about and look at when you read the book. The next book I read is Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I have been holding off to read this one because I own every single Sally Rooney book in paperback, and this had only been available in hardcover, and I refuse to have one single hardcover when I have every single other book in paperback. If you know anything about me, I will read anything Sally Rooney has to write. I love her work. Normal People is one of my all-time favorite reads. So as soon as this came out, I knew I was going to read it. I was just waiting till the right time and until it was available in paperback. This book essentially follows 2 brothers who are both grappling with their grief and their relationships with others after their father passes away. Both brothers are very different, and they also have a significant age gap between the 2 of them, so they are approaching lives in very different ways and are in a very different stage of their life. We follow Ivan and Peter, and I will say, I think Ivan is one of the most likable Sally Rooney protagonists we have ever seen. Sorry for Robot coming by. And I think Peter is one of the most unlikable protagonists we have ever seen. Ivan is a chess prodigy, and you really follow him dealing with his relationship with chess and also his relationship with an older woman throughout the book. And Peter is a lawyer who is dealing with his relationship between 2 women and is kind of in a love triangle type circumstance. And I found Peter to be insufferable. while I found Ivan to be very likable, making very realistic decisions for what his life is looking like. I think that led to me having some issues with the book because I just could not stand Peter, but overall it was really enjoyable and I rated it 4.5 stars. And honestly, even if it's not my favorite Sally Rooney book, I will pick up whatever she writes next, so I think it's a good read. Also, I've heard it works for a lot of people who are not big Sally Rooney fans or have not liked her other books, so maybe it's worth a try even if you're not a big Sally Rooney fan already. Okay, I do not own a copy of this next one because I listened to it on audiobook for my book club, but the next book I read was First Time Caller by B.K. Borison. This is a silly romance, and it follows the story between a radio host and a mother after the mother's daughter calls into the radio asking for romantic advice for her mom. This kind of spirals into a series of events and leads to the mom being on a radio show literally to help her find love. And of course, instead of finding love via dates or finding love with other methods, she, of course, is falling for the radio host. It is silly. It is fun. It was everything I wanted in February when I was reading this and really just craving something to lean into the Valentine's Day of it all. And it was a really enjoyable read. I do love radio as a setting as someone who did college radio, so I thought it was a lot of fun. I will say the male main character, really frustrating at times, but also a total sweetheart and wants the best for our female main character. And I also will say some of the radio portrayal doesn't make sense based on what I know about like real life radio production, but you know, it's a silly, goofy romance. Does it really need to make sense every single time? I don't think so. I ended up giving it 3 stars. The next book I read was Birnam by Eleanor Catton. I really loved this book, and even though I only gave it 4 stars, I have been thinking about it pretty frequently that I've been wondering if I should update my rating because of how much this book has just lingered with me and been one that I thought about so much. This essentially follows a guerrilla gardening group in New Zealand, and there is this national park that has a landslide, so the national park becomes mainly inaccessible to anyone other than residents of the area. And the guerrilla gardening group decides to take over this essentially abandoned farm and start planting crops there so that they can sell them and bring them back and hopefully continue funding their guerrilla gardening program. However, a tech billionaire becomes involved and things get really, really messy really quickly. It is so interesting. I really loved seeing just the kind of like wild story unfold. I loved the relationship. I also really enjoyed just seeing more of New Zealand, and you get a lot of this like natural environment in New Zealand that I knew pretty much nothing about, and I found that really fascinating. I also don't know a ton about gardening, so I really enjoyed hearing all the different steps that they would have to go through. But it is such a messy book. It is so fun, so entertaining. I could not put it down. I just had to know what happened. The only reason I gave it 4 stars is I felt like the ending was a bit abrupt. Like, it feels like out of nowhere the book just kind of ends, and it feels like there's so many left questions, so many things that haven't been said that you kind of are still wondering about. So I would have liked to have more of like an epilogue conclusion type thing in this book. I think it is so good. I highly, highly recommend this book. The next book I read this year was The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry by Gabrielle Zevin. This author I have read another book from, and I really enjoyed it, so I wanted to pick up The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry because I know it's a very popular book. I don't think it quite worked for me though, but I do think it's still worthwhile to read depending on what your tastes are. I gave it 3.5 stars. This book follows A.J. Fikry as he essentially goes through life and grief after his wife passes away, and during this time period of him kind of still grappling with his grief, a baby is left on his doorstep, and he ends up raising this baby from childhood through pretty much her adulthood, and the book just follows his life, the things that change, the things that develop as he suddenly has a new child in his life. And I think that this type of book could really work for a lot of people, of just getting this whole saga of a person's life and the things that happen. And there are a lot of touching moments that I think really are cute and really nice, but I I also kind of felt like it was almost too simple and I wanted more of a plot and story at points, but it is nice and it is really sweet. I also think AJ Fikry is a bit of a snob, and they kind of say that, like he's very self-aware of it, but I think that it's hard when you're going through a character's life, and I found him to be unlikable at points. Overall, I think it's a good, cute book, just not quite in my taste profile. The next book I also don't have, and it is An Academic Affair by Jodi McAllister. This book takes us back to Oceania, but it is set in Australia this time, and follows two academic rivals who end up in a marriage of convenience so that they can both get a professorship position in Hobart, Australia. I guess their field is very, very competitive, so there's not very many professor positions at all. So they essentially end up in this situation where one of them gets hired and they decide to get a partner hire for their rival so that they can both get hired and both get a position. There's kind of more to why that decision happens, but you essentially just follow them go through this marriage of convenience, go from rivals to lovers. Very silly romance and really, really fun. I think it kind of reminds me of The Love Hypothesis or Love Theoretically, so if you enjoyed those books and enjoyed the kind of academic side of things, you probably will like this one. You also get a lot of different lovable characters in this, with the male main character's sister being very sweet and very kind, as well as this winery owner who really just shows so much care and investment in our main characters' lives. So I found that really enjoyable. I think that some of the issues is that this partner hire thing felt a little far-fetched to me at times. I'm not sure how realistic that is, but I have never heard of that personally, so I kind of had question marks going on in my head throughout, but I still really, really enjoyed it. I also wanted to see more of our female main character's relationship with her sister, because there is like this conflict that happens between them, but I felt like I wanted more context before we got to that conflict and didn't feel like I had enough build-up. But I think if you're looking for a silly, goofy romance, this one totally fits the bill, and you get enough development into the characters beyond the romance to where I think it's really enjoyable. The next book I read during Q1 of this year was 11/22/63 by Stephen King. This book follows a man who goes back in time to stop the JFK assassination. You get so much of what life was like in the 50s and 60s in this book, and it is very clear that Stephen King put a lot of care and research into the culture and lifestyle that existed in the 50s and 60s. I gave it 3 stars, and I have so many issues with this book to where when I think about it right now, it almost makes me angry. The portrayal of women in this book is horrible, and it is very clear that our female main character is just a romantic interest to our male main character. That being said, I do appreciate the amount of research that went into this book, so I felt like I didn't want to give it below 3 stars because I can tell the amount of work that went in, but I don't think I would recommend it, and I've been reading more Stephen King, and unfortunately, I think that this is a common thread I'm seeing across many of his books. The last book I read during Q1 of this year was The Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. Look at my cute little mass market paperback version of these with the tiny font. I actually listened to these via audiobook, but I received these as a gift, so I keep them for safekeeping. Storm of Swords is the 3rd book in the Game of Thrones series, and I gave it 4 stars. When I read Storm of Swords, I suddenly realized that books 1 and 2 of Game of Thrones almost feel like exposition for this book. It is so much better than the first 2 books, and really ups the ante in terms of stakes, in terms of character development, and in terms of everything going on. We essentially have many different characters vying for power and vying for the throne, and I felt like the first 2 books, you're kind of just leading up to what's going to happen. Things start to rapidly happen. Many characters are in life or death situations. I really, really enjoyed it. I will say I still think the beginning starts a bit slow, which is pretty typical for George R.R. Martin books, but this gave me so much more motivation to finish the series and really brought me back to the Game of Thrones universe in a way that I honestly was kind of falling out of when I read the first 2 books. Those are all the books I read in Q1 of this year. I'm really proud of myself for reading 12 books even when I was dealing with a reading slump, and I'm looking forward to how many more books I can read this year and hopefully all the good reading I can do. If you enjoyed this one, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one and talking about all the good reading I'm getting up to.